So, yes, responsibly using viewport units effectively, or mostly effectively. There's going to be a few things I'm probably not going to cover, such as some of the extensive bugs, Safari bugs usually around using viewport units. I think it's always good to check on, when you're building a site, check on what your audience uses. And yeah, if you've got users who are like using old versions of Safari, then yeah, viewport units are probably not for you. There are also issues with things we might want to mention later, like CSS functions combined with viewport units like CSS clamp, which are also a little bit buggy. But I'm not going to go into those things very much. I think a good place to start with viewport units is saying what they are. But I think just before I say what they are, I think it's best to understand what's meant by, understand the fact that there are actually quite a few units, different units in CSS, such as pixels, EM and REM, and percent and character units, and of course viewport units. But regardless of that, they pretty much all they all compute down to CSS pixels, and I'll show you that in action later. So they're all abstractions of something that effectively becomes a pixel dimension. CSS pixels are slightly different from regular pixels. CSS pixels are a sort of an abstraction of pixels. You might have noticed back in the, well, maybe over 10 years ago, probably now, if you got a screen that had a high resolution, the website would look physically small on that screen, because CSS pixels and sort of screen pixels were the same thing. Whereas now, if you've got a high definition screen, that might mean that you've got two screen pixels mapped to one CSS pixel, and then on a lower density screen, just one regular pixel mapped to a CSS pixel. So yeah, the idea of a CSS pixel is an abstract thing, and all of the units effectively computed to produce a CSS pixel result, and I will show you that in action later on. So yeah, the viewport units are, so you can work out a viewport. You have 100 VW or 100 viewport width units is 100% of your browser's viewport. Now that's not actually a percentage, or it is, you could say it's 100%, but it's actually the pixel value of that proportion of that measurement. Say if you had 1,000 pixel wide viewport, and you have something that measured 1 VW and width, it would be it would be 10 pixels wide. Yeah, and if you have something 1,440 wide, 5 viewport units would be 70 pixels. But you could also say it the other way around, and this actually is a slightly more useful way of thinking about it when it comes to the sort of problems we have with viewport units, which is you could say that for an element that has, say, let's go back to the original example, for an element that's 1 vertical viewport width unit wide, then in order, if you're wanting that element to be 10 pixels visible, to have a sort of a 10 pixel computed size, then the viewport must be expanded to 1,000 pixels. And this is often the problem with, well, this is the main problem with viewport units, is in controlling that and not making sure that viewport units don't, or things sized with viewport units don't go down past the limits we want or go up past the limits we want. Because when they do so, it often produces very broken looking design. I think actually what we want from the viewport units is for them to make our lives as developers easier and not harder. We want to be able to interpolate the different sizes between two sizes and have some surety and certainty that scale is going to be accurate and proportional, and that we're not going to have things that are going to suddenly be way bigger than we intended or way smaller. And we also don't want to have to write many extra media queries in order to control things, because most of us, we don't have time really. So yeah, it's best to make sure, like I mentioned other viewport units before, and I will mention these again, because what we actually often do is combine these units using another CSS function. Actually, I'll just nip through in a slide now. We should. We combine other viewport units using a CSS function called calc, which can take any CSS unit and produce a CSS pixel result, which you can then assign to a property. We'll come back onto that in a little while. But yeah, we use other units in combination with viewport units, and so I want to mention what some of those things were. I think some confusion over units in general with CSS comes because we're used to, so if you've got something that has a sort of fixed dimension, we're used to the fact that historical and many political, social reasons that it's possible to measure something with many different scales, and we use single scales like metric in order to effectively just make our lives easier, so we don't have to convert between different measurements. But the outcome itself, the item being measured, isn't different, and I think that's where some confusion with CSS unit comes in, because people use that kind of mental model over what they think measurements are and try and apply that and be like, well, why should it make a difference if I'm using rem or em or pixel or ch, or I think you can actually even use things like centimeters and millimeters. I've never done so in the browser, but it actually doesn't quite fit as a mental model. And I think the best way to think about all CSS units, including viewport units, is think of them as functions, things which produce a result. And I mean, they do compute down into CSS pixels. They all do. Even pixels is you're defining a pixel width of size that's been computed to CSS pixels, and these are the implementation of that across different screen densities is handled by the browser. So it is itself an abstraction, even though it's just a pixel, it's still not actually a physical screen pixel. Percentages, they mean different things. If we're talking about sort of elements on a page, then something which is 50% of width will be 50% of the width of its container. Don't think about that in terms of font sizes, because 50% font size won't set a font to being a proportion or 50% of its container. It will set it to 50% of the font size set on its nearest parent. So EM units and REM units, they're pretty interesting. They're very useful when it comes to combining with viewport units. But I should try and sort of describe what they are first. An EM unit, EM units and REM units, they're kind of unitless numbers. So rem is, if you set an element, rem always refers to the font size set on the document object model, which is the sort of tree that represents the whole website's root, and that's the HTML node. You'll notice sometimes when you go to websites, sometimes people set these things manually. They set the font size of the root to be a certain way, and then use and then measure everything else on their page in REM, and then adjust the size of base font size on the root module, and then make all of those elements sized in REM that are children of that parent change proportionally. This is actually a kind of a slight sort of bastardization of the original purpose of them, I think, which is to not set the font size on the person's browser, but rather to leave that to the browser or to the user's settings. And then all of those sizes then derive from those user settings. So say you set your nav bar to be 1.5 rem, then that will be one rem is one root element font size, which is default of 16, so 0.5 is 8, and so 1.5 rem will be 24 pixels. But that's only provided that the default of 16 pixels, which is generally the default sort of base font size, is at 16. You know, if we increased that base font size to 32 pixels, then that 1.5 REM of the nav would be, instead of being 24, it would be 48, because I doubled the base font size. I mean, I kept the maths there simply for myself because my mental arithmetic isn't fantastic. M units are similar to REM units. I described how a child which has, say, has its dimensions set, or font sizes, or literally whatever set in REM, is size relative to that root module. So 1 REM, when the base font size is 16 pixels, will be 16 pixels. EM units behave in a similar manner to that, a very similar manner, except instead of looking towards the root, they look towards their parents or themselves, which is incredibly useful, because if you set, for instance, if you set a font size of let's say 16 pixels, or one REM, doesn't matter, because it will compute to CSS pixels, although don't always use pixels necessarily. I'll come on to that maybe later. Yeah, if you have your base font size of a say a header, H1 header is set as 16 pixels, and you want it to have a margin, bottom margin of that's set to like half the proportional kind of half that font size, then you set it to 0.5 EM. Now 0.5 EM isn't necessarily, well, it is in this case, but it's not. If, for instance, in this case, like, you know, it's 16 pixels, and then the font, then the margin bottom of 0.5 EM will be 8 pixels. So it works in the same way, but instead of looking to the root node for its source, for that base font size, looking just to itself or the immediate parent. But it means, yeah, you can set a margin or letter spacing that's proportional to the font size of that element. Or for instance, you know, it's very useful. You might have a box containing a font at a certain size, and you want some subtitle next to it or inside the same size, which is always maybe a unit or like a pound sign or something, which is always like 3/4 of the height or size approximately of that. However, that other font is scaled, then use EM, because then they will automatically scale to their parent or to themselves if no font is set on if the font is set on itself. And that's very useful, because I mean, ultimately, if we say we set a header to be in viewport units, so the size will scale when I adjust the page, or depending on how wide the page is, or tall if we're using viewport height units, then EM units will also scale accordingly. Whereas if I was to use pixel units, for instance, say I was to set the margin bottom of a header in as 8 pixels, but then the header itself is set in viewport units, so it expands, you move, but the margin will stay 8 pixels. It won't also expand. So yeah, there's some we can use some of these elements, some of these units together to sort of orchestrate other elements on the page, and try and reduce our workload a little bit. Okay. Let's move on to here. Yeah, I think just a little talking about how you design viewport units as well, and another reason as to why viewport units are useful. I think I've done a little bit of both design. Well, say a little bit, quite a lot of both, quite a lot of design, and also written tons and tons of CSS. And so even when I was doing designs and then turning my designs into pages, sometimes the results aren't always what you imagine. Like you say, you've designed a mobile screen at sort of 320 pixels wide, and the headers look proportional, everything looks nice. You like how many lines the text is, maybe there's text underneath it's taking up. You design, you build that, then you view it on a mobile phone that's maybe 345 pixels wide. Well, this time maybe the header is instead of being on 3 lines is on 2 lines. Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe you've designed it bigger and you're going to go smaller and that's wrapped to another line. Or maybe now there's a word orphan. It basically just it changes. In an automated way. It changes the moving the page, or increasing the browser width can change the look of your design in a way which isn't predictable. You don't necessarily want. You visualize the header having a certain flow. Maybe there's a certain word being on a certain line, and now you view it on another device, and it's no longer like that. Like websites don't scale like images, but designers think about scaling in that manner. And whilst designers maybe think in terms of 2 couple of screens, mobile, tablet, desktop, often developers have to themselves think about the middle positions between those states. Like sort of a phablet size. Where suddenly because you design the things to look good on a smaller mobile, when they're designed on a bigger, wider mobile, like you've got tons of white space or that kind of multi-line sort of paragraph of text that's appearing is now just like one single line has lost any sort of visual impact on the page. And developers usually have to think about all sorts of, as it were, interpolate from the designs they've been given what the mid-state should be. But viewport units actually allow us to create pages or elements of those pages which scale scale proportion, which I think is how a lot of designers maybe think. And what I found with viewport units is it allowed me when I was sort of designing things to create less screens. And I was creating those screens myself because developing anything without an actual design is really horrible. Or rather, like it's always better to work out problems at the design stage. It's far cheaper from a time and effort point of view to work out any problem at the design stage, proportion or some overlap or something that doesn't fit. It enables us it enables the developer and the designer to be a little bit more on the same page. That the screens that the designer side hands over to the developer represent sort of keyframes. You can thought about an animation, for instance, of something turning around or moving. You interpolate those positions between those keyframes, and you kind of imagine what there will be. Viewport units effectively allow us to do that, to make things scale proportionately between a minimum and a maximum, which is great. And it also means that a designer can just design screens that don't fit this. So say if they were showing rather than showing designing loads of different mobile views, they can, you could, I mean, last something I did recently, this was just because I was learning, I've been moved over to Figma recently from Sketch, and I just made like I was actually wanting to use, learning how to use Figma a bit, so I basically just created a joke, kind of a good Joker project. I still can't use this program very well. Yeah, that's a desktop view here. And then mobile view here. Now, the way I've got this set up is that I don't have any, I mean, I'm sort of half building this at the moment, so that's not going to be lead to anything, just because I will try out custom properties as well. But this desktop view will also be the tablet view, because these elements here, this header can scale proportionately, these pods can scale proportionately, and this overlap here takes care of this overlap here visually takes care of like larger screen sizes, and it can be cropped. Actually, that image of that frog could be cropped, and so you know the only thing we change on mobile is making things stack, but on mobile everything expands proportionally as well. So and actually here's an example here. I mean, I'll show you why what I'm about to show you here is built in the wrong way shortly, but this is a quite horrible landing page that I built ages ago for company. It's not, I think it's still on the web somewhere, but this is just a production version with, sorry, just a developed version with broken images apparently. But this is a responsive site. So you see it goes here from, it's pretty standard, goes from glass of water, desktop to tablet. But then when we go to mobile, this is a mobile view. You see here that actually the things you could imagine this as being sort of an image. You know, all of these things. Well, I mean, probably not all. But like these input boxes, these fonts here, everything scales proportionately. You know, they keep the same number of lines. You don't get like header orphans, etc., etc. Actually, these here, just sort of talking about, I was talking about EMs earlier. EM units. Here we see, hopefully anyway. Yeah, here look, I've this was back in the day when I didn't trust Flexbox. I was still using table and table cell properties, which is not the same as using table and table cell HTML. Don't get confused. It's still perfectly valid to use display table cell. It's not valid to use create layouts with tables. Two different things. But yeah, here we see I've defined the font size here in the VW units. It's both here because I've got a pixel fallback, which is naturally being crossed out because of the cascade, CSS cascade. So yeah, I've got the font size defined in VW Viewport Units, and I've got what have we got? Something. Yeah, I've got and that's on the parent. On the on the children, I've got padding there defined in EM. So the padding will always be proportional to slightly less than half of whatever the computed value of that viewport unit font size is. And actually, I'll just show you here. This is really useful. It's perfectly reasonable you've maybe not clicked on the computer tab before. It's very possible. But here we see what I mean by everything, all units being computed, because whilst this is being defined in viewport units, when we get those computed, it's 26.25 pixels. And actually, if I move this page, this value will also change. Hopefully, yeah. And we go back to it again. Yeah, it's now 30.135 pixels. Just a good rule of thumb, if you ever see a computed value which is got a floating point number, it's generally being computed from something. Not always, but generally. What else was I going to say?
So yeah, designing enables like the design and development experience to have more clarity and to feed into each other a little bit more, and there to be less shocks. You know, the designer isn't going to when they get the finished page back, isn't going to move the page or resize it and see the aesthetics and the proportions of their design disappear because the scale is set to the scale of the page. Yeah, this isn't it's not a wondrous. I'll just read. Actually, I'll just see this. This should go down all the way down to 320. Actually, it's all the way down to 140 there. It's still not completely broken. But let's put it to 320, which is like iPhone size. I would have designed this for. I still design for 320 sometimes. Still looks fine. Looks the same proportions. Put that up to 400. Same proportions. 500, same proportions. Whereas like normally we'd be seeing text reflow to single lines, gaps between things staying the same, regardless of the screen width. And so it's all about aesthetics. It doesn't actually change the content or make things more or less readable. It's all about trying to make things look nice in the states between those states that have actually been explicitly designed or specified. Yeah, okay. Let's say. This is something I already said before. Yeah, it's far cheaper to think about scaling proportion of the design stage. You know, you can take, I mean, for instance, and you can actually use it to get values as well. So go back to my Figma project here. So I think what I did here was to take that text and then I haven't used Figma much. I can't remember how I actually did it. It's just like as a keyboard shortcut. I haven't just reduced the font size and the line height. I have scaled it in Figma, and then I've then read what font size and line height it's calculated, and then I can use that as a starting point. Now I can also take that and use that as my minimum font size, part of my font size range in my CSS as well, which is pretty useful. Whereas, yeah, like not thinking about that and then trying to then see that the thing is working when you build the thing, well, not working, just doesn't look as good as it could. You'll have to then think about it, undo things. It's annoying, you know. Yeah. And then any exceptions to this scale, that's what the designer can design. You can be like, okay, this is going to scale like an image proportionally, except for this block of text, which I just want to not scale, but to position out. Or maybe you would say that this phone here, when it reaches a sort of a certain wide size, then suddenly the header sort of stops, only takes up half the screen, or the text only takes up half the screen. So you specify that like exception to a proportional scale or proportional increase in size in the design, rather than like sort of arduously drawing up things that don't actually describe anything unexpected. Better to describe the unexpected in the design. But with viewport units, you can make it an expectation that on mobile that everything will have the same proportion, and on desktop as well. What's next? There's always, now I should mention, I mentioned about sort of cross-browser compatibility issues. You know, if you've got users who are using like old versions of Safari or various other combinations, you're going to have problems. Sometimes viewport units aren't recalculated on zooming out or on page moving, all sorts of weird stuff that has to be polyfilled. But fundamentally, like they do, I don't know if that actually has an SEO issue because it's not my kind of thing, but if you set viewport units on items, you can because their size always depends on the viewport size, and if we zoom in or out, that doesn't actually change. You can actually end up preventing
text from sizing up. And particularly so when you prevent being able to zoom in, and I think if you prevent being able to zoom in by 200%, it's like it's WCAIG, AIG, I can't remember, the Web Standards Accessibility Body. It's a failure, it's classed as a failure on automated tests, and I think maybe Google factor those things in now. You might end up getting a hit because might end up taking a hit to your SEO because you can't scale up your fonts past 200%. It's good to look at those things. Although from what I've seen, even on really big sites, even on sites where people aren't necessarily using Viewport Units, people are setting the font size on the root node and preventing users from being able to resize the pages. It's kind of pretty normal. It tends to be only sort of news sites and blogs that respect screen readers or people overriding their font settings in their page itself, which Pixel will always ignore. People say, "I'll just use pixels," but then it's like, okay, the user's gone and set their font size in their settings. You go to Chrome settings, appearance, very large font. What that will do is literally it will increase the size of the font across the page or across your site. Anything set in pixels won't change. So actually, I think you see developers using setting things in pixel sizes to actually prevent this from happening, where they've got a design that visually completely breaks if somebody sets the font to the overrides the font size. So all that stuff's up to you, really. I look into it. Okay, so this is when it starts to get, I suppose, yeah, kind of fun. So I've mentioned how everything's a unit. Everything's a CSS unit, and this function here. So I mean, you see. Well, firstly, actually, I'll show you the way to actually. Before I've done this, the way not to write CSS. Sorry, the way not to write CSS is to not have a massive sort of 1,000-line file here. I should have split it into separate blocks. But it's like 5 or 6 years old. I've moved on from there, I think. But the way not to do viewport units, despite the fact that I'm going to fall back here, what I'm actually doing with this page and the elements on this sign up page is to use tons and tons of media queries to control that size. I'm saying that, and except for, and then at the very top media query, i.e. like the maximum size, so like you move past a certain point, a large desktop, just to move back to fixed sizes again. But I'm controlling the fact that the font scale increases too much or too little. I'm controlling that by overriding by setting the viewport size, setting the size of the font or all the elements, the height or whatever in viewport units at each individual breakpoint. Yeah, which is incredibly laborious. It'd be far nicer if instead of these things being controlled, if we could set it like once, we could say, okay, between this minimum viewport size of say 320 and this maximum viewport size of say 900, and with this font size, minimum font size of 16 and maximum font size of 34, that the font size will always be scaled according to the range of the viewport size, I guess difference, yeah, the range of viewport size and the range of minimum to maximum font size, like a lock. We can do this with CSS. You can do this with clamps, I think. See, it's using CSS clamp, but a slightly nicer way to do it, the way I did not come up with myself, I must add, if you hadn't already guessed that, is oh no. Here we are.
yeah, is to use a formula like this. Oh God. Okay. So yeah, I'll just go through this quickly. Like, I think you can, generally speaking, use formulas like this as boilerplate. You can say you can put them in, you can use them, and not have to worry too much. Now this is slightly, don't be confused too much with the top on it. Oh dear, I'm giving a view into the future. This is pseudocode, minimum size, maximum size, but underneath you can see kind of this computed size here. So sort of pixel equivalent sizes. So I'll just go through how this formula works very quickly. So yeah, here we see we have that 100 VW, which is like whatever the screen size is, whatever the total viewport size is, minus the minimum viewport width. That gives you, I guess, the current amount of resizing in those units. And then make sure I get this right. I'm just doing it all yesterday. I did also use this as boilerplate. But the maximum viewport width and the minimum viewport width, that's the total range of sizes. And when we divide one by the other, we get a unit that's fraction, which is like shows the ratio of those two things. So yeah, like so for instance, if you would have if the viewport was 900, if that was a maximum of 900 pixels wide, that was the range we're operating in. The viewport is 900 pixels wide. So say your breakpoint will go up to say like max width 900 pixels, because you're still dealing with breakpoints, to the top and bottom of ranges. But yeah, let's say it's 900 pixels wide. Yeah, so that would give you, as we see here, that would be 900 minus 320 divided by 900 minus 320, which would give you 1. So yeah, so that would be effectively, that would be full. And if you take 34 minus 16, which is 18. So that's the total possible range, and then you times that by that ratio, and then you add on 16 pixel, which is actually your minimum. Then you get what your font size should be with this formula, which is like something like 20 pixels. No, it wouldn't be here. It would be it'd be 34 pixels, because you're effectively you're taking 34 times by 1, which is 1. If the viewport was half its size, then 100 VW would mean 450 pixels wide. That would give you a ratio there of like 0.5. So then you'd be which would give you like 20-ish, 20 something pixels, I think. But when you've added that result onto the 16 pixels, yeah, so that's about right. I mean, you see this formula a lot. You see it on Stripe. Like in InVision, you see lots of different, maybe not ones as full as this, but varieties of it where you're creating a ratio from the ratio of the current viewport sizing and the sort of difference between the maximum and the minimum viewport sizing, and then using that to scale a font size and make that proportional. Yeah, lots of people use it. But you can use it as just boilerplate and not worry about it too much, I think. So what's next?
I had WCAG. It's a WCAG failure. I couldn't remember what the body was called. Great. Okay, so I was just going to, so actually running a bit short on time now. I haven't timed myself very well. I'll just show you, I'll go through a couple of examples of a couple of ways of integrating viewport units. One is one you see, I think Netflix used to use it. This is a technique, maybe still do on some of their things. I found one example. You often see this technique used on art sites. This is a guy's portfolio. He's a developer, creative developer. Creates a lot of like full page digital experiences. And scrolling down on his site, so that's doing all sorts of interesting stuff. So yeah, if we go to his site here, I mean everything he's doing here is CSS. He's creating those scrolling behavior, everything. You can see like other things moving around using Translate 3D. So if we go to the HTML, this is the root node I was talking about. You see here he's doing, I mean he's not quite doing, he's doing a kind of like simplified version of the equation we're doing here. And he's sort of, what he's doing, he's setting his font size on the root node in the viewport units. This will have a calculated size, we can check what this is. 4.765 pixels. Sounds like he's just gone from the massive magic number approach here. And then everything else on this page, I don't follow that logic. Everything else on this page is sized with root element units. So if we go to style here, yeah, fonts are REM list. I think everything he's got here pretty much has explicitly set size is the same size as REM. I'm clicking everything that doesn't seem to be involved that, so that's good. But yeah, he's doing everything here, and anything he's got with a fixed size is REM, because there isn't actually very much there. But yeah, like, except for the fonts. But the fonts is a decent example there. That's a one-liner where he set the font size and the line height and the font in one line. I tend to do it in multiple lines. He's doing his transforms there in pixels. Don't ignore that. It's because he's also reading the dimensions of the page and tracing those values, those movements with JavaScript. So it doesn't really matter. The thing can't be proportional anyway. It's being manually taking the dimensions of the page and moving things accordingly with JavaScript. But yeah, like that font size 15 rem there will be is effectively 15 times what that computed font value is set on the root node, whatever it was, 4.25 pixels or something. That was the computed size. And anything you set on this page, just go down. Yeah, and almost anything on this page. I fact, this guy does a lot of this. Like, that's the name of scrolling. Is everything? If you set anything on this page in rem, then all those units will be orchestrated from the body. But like, you can't really. If I'm zooming in here, like it sort of works, but like it's something not quite right. You can see the view changing. It's sort of, it will change the media queries at a certain point. They respond. Nothing else, which is annoying. I think it's okay though to use for like portfolio sites, art sites. I think it's an okay technique to use to override the font size. It's a choice for sort of like an interactive presentation. If your website's more an interactive presentation rather than sort of an encyclopedia that needs to have that anyone should be able to read and should be plain text or whatever. I think it's kind of okay. There's context there. Yeah. The other alternative is get off my PowerPoint. I've got anything I've forgotten about. About this. PowerPoint. We've already talked about my ultra time consuming effort. That means like where I'm setting the viewport units on every item, and then stop them sort of expanding past the point where I'd want and get it being too big for containers. I've restricted those by successive breakpoints, right up to the largest breakpoint when those viewport units become just, well, fixed units, in this case EM units, or here, look, my last topmost breakpoint is always just fixed units effectively there. I wouldn't do it like that. You'll be sort of like working forever and ever, pretty much. Another way of doing it is actually the way I've already shown you. It's the kind of stripe method, I guess. Here's a sort of sample page I've done here. Excellent headline about frogs. Yeah, I've taken that from the thing I was doing, showed you earlier. So we see that the font here scales proportionately. Mostly 440 it doesn't. But 320. That's pretty nice. Works fairly well. I mean, this is just, if we just come to here, this is just using, all I'm doing here is using okay, so that's on page. Well, I'm using the formula I described before. I'll show that to you. I'm also using custom properties. It's something else I've come to recently, but I've noticed that when combined, well, people use them with great effect with things like viewport units. It's not really a point about viewport units themselves. It's just that my voice is going. I'm very sorry. It's just that it makes orchestrating viewport units like far nicer. I mean, it doesn't. Yeah, we could. So for instance, here, like I'm defining these different scales here, and I can change the things on the property level with media queries. Like, yeah, you can do all sorts of things with these. Just trying to find I've actually got the title font size here. So here, look, I'm using that calculation you saw there, slightly different version of it, which I'm like, but pretty much exactly the same thing. But I'm using custom properties here, and that means that those are different. For instance, here, look, we see I'm using a media query here. That's like min width 35.75. It's like from 600 pixels up to, and then mid width, so it's about 1,200 pixels. Here, look, I'm just defining. I get to just define. I've already put those variables inside that formula, and I can just use media queries to just redefine those variables at that level. And it's you can do the same. You don't need custom properties to do that. You don't need them at all. But it gets really nice. I mean, even just doing things like, I mean, this isn't viewport units per se, but and you can do this. I know you can do all this stuff without them. So I'm drowning in inspectors, inspect element things here. Dear, must be this one. Yes. You know, so even just doing things like this is one page. Yeah, like yellow, you know, like stuff like that, like theming, or just passing any variable between anything and swapping them out, depending on media query or the presence of a parent class, is just so effortless. Like here's like a bunch of different themes. Look, even for like that sort of neuromorph button. Look, I've got a button there with, and I've only had to define it once, you know, because I've just defined each of those different colours as a different custom property, and then can load them in by per theme, and then just stick that on the yeah, you just put that on as a class on the effect section. I know you could do that with descendant selectors or all sorts of other ways, but it's but you also kind of sort of can't as well. You know, if I change, you can make a change here on the, and actually this brings me on. This is something you can't do without loads of. This is something that custom properties makes very easy. But you see here, I've got, for instance, window width. Now, you might be wondering why I don't have that set in terms of 100 VW like in the formula. Well, it actually is, except it's where have I got this? It's so window width is actually. So I'm just trying to find where I've got the thing. Window width. Yeah. Yeah. So here, look, window width. I've defined it as being 100 VW minus scroll bar width. Now, scroll bar width there is set as 0. Now, there's a problem with implementing viewport units, which is in the presence of scroll bars, different browsers can calculate what's 100 VW or not. Some take into account scroll bars, some don't. It seems to be better to take into account scroll bars as a fixed size, which you have to do with a bit of JavaScript. I mean, there's some, it's not my own, and you probably debounce it. Where I've set, where I'm effectively reading the, yeah, here for instance, look, I'm reading the scroll bar width there, getting some 15 pixels, defining, because you can interact with custom properties directly in JavaScript, there's a direct API to do that. But then I'm then factoring that size in into yeah, I'm factoring that size in here. So that 15 pixels gets subtracted. I think that's a fixed size. It gets subtracted from whatever that computed size is there. And then window width is always then when you get back to the oh god, James. Yeah, when you get back to the actual where the formula is here, that means that window width is always 100 VW minus whatever the scroll bar is, and that'll be updated because you'll need to update custom properties in one place. So yeah, custom properties aren't exclusively to do with viewport units, but they make orchestrating viewport units far easier. What's to say? I think that's it. What more to say? I think, yeah, viewport units are interesting. There are still a few problems to do with them, but you can now see their use far more in the wild, as it were. And it seems that many development teams are more happy to use viewport units in production. Yeah, that's me done.